Hello, welcome to this episode of the Catechetical Corner, handing on and defending the faith. In the previous episode, attendees of a workshop put on by the Office of Catechetics called Answering Atheism, the Philosophical Principles of Catechesis, examined the statistical probability of fine-tuning in the universe and an explanation about why Richard Dawkins, a propagandist for the new atheism, assertion that biological evolution has disproved the existence of God is false. In this concluding episode, we will examine the claim that many atheists make when justifying their moral beliefs based on the norms of science, the personal experience of an individual, or societal norms that have evolved over time in the culture throughout history. Are these really a sound place to justify morality? Or does an objective moral law exist outside of these things because it was revealed to humanity by an eternal lawgiver? Let's find out. Now, if the source of the universe comes not from within it but something outside of it, I want to show you how the source of morality doesn't come from within evolution, from within a person, or from within society. It doesn't come from within those three things. It comes from something what? Outside of them. It was there before any of that got here, and it'll be here after all those things are what? Are gone. This is very important for young people to understand. Because if God is the infinite goodness, and we're going to determine whether or not something is right or what, we have to have a measuring stick, and the measuring stick is the ultimate good, and that is God. So God did not reveal that something is an abomination now, and all of a sudden, because popular opinion says it's not, all of a sudden it didn't become an abomination. Otherwise, he contradicted himself. And I think everybody in this room knows exactly what I'm talking about. It's a hot button topic. It's a great way to address it with the kids. Okay. Now, I have a sign here, once again, from Edward Fraser. Let's look at it for a second. How significant is Aristotle? Aristotle is an ancient philosopher. Thomas Aquinas built off his metaphysical philosophy when he wrote his Summa. And most philosophers, up until the Enlightenment, practiced in classical philosophy the principle of metaphysics. I gave you a definition for that. Modern philosophers, post the Enlightenment, have abandoned that. And I would like to illustrate for you the consequence of that. Okay? So he says, how significant is Aristotle? Well, I wouldn't want to exaggerate, so let me put it this way. Abandoning Aristotelianism, as the founder of modern philosophies have done, was the single greatest mistake ever made in the history of Western thought. Let's look at metaphysics by definition first. What is metaphysics? It's that which is beyond the physical. The quest to understand the immaterial reality of the universe, such as your spirit, your existence. We kind of talked about it earlier, right? Being itself, which is God, right? Mind, soul, will, intellect, thought, judgment. We do these things every day, right? We don't think about them, we just do them, right? Emotion, memory, imagination, etc. This is really central to our understanding of both God and the human person. For God is pure spirit, and we are a body united to a spirit and soul. We're a composite being. All those powers which distinguish man from animals, the things we talked about earlier, they're metaphysical powers. And we do them all the time. We don't think twice about them. It's just natural for us to do those things. An example, okay? In classical philosophy, there are four causes. Formal cause, material cause, efficient cause, and final cause. Let's take the chair you're sitting in for an example. If somebody came in here right now and destroyed all the chairs you were sitting, would that destroy the idea of a chair? No, because somebody could come back in, right? And like rebuild the chair. Okay, well, the form of the chair, the formal cause is the concept of chair. The material reality of the chair is whatever substance it takes to build the chair, right? That's the material cause of the chair. Follow that? Okay. You have to have somebody who has like a three-dimensional mind and knows how to do carpentry or like can really build, unless you got like a machine doing it, right? That's the efficient cause of the chair being brought from nothing into what? Into something. We talked about that, right? And what's the final purpose of the chair? Well, it's to do what you're doing in it right now. It's to what? It's to sit down. Okay, so let's just kind of walk through that for ourselves. Okay? Think about you as a person, right? We said we're a body-soul composite. What's the idea of you? Well, it's your soul. It's masculine or it's feminine. And the material reality of that is your human what? Nature, your body, your biological body. And what's the efficient cause of you? Well, we said earlier, I wouldn't be here as the effect of my parents unless they got together as a cause and brought me into what? Existence. So your parents are your efficient cause. And what's your final purpose? I said it earlier in the Catechism. To love God, to know God, to serve God, and to be with God for all eternity. Now, if we establish that and know that about every single human person we encounter, we're going to treat them a lot differently, right? We're going to treat them as someone, not what? Something. It is theology of the body. I'm not going to get on that soapbox today, but yeah, that's exactly what it is. So let's eliminate for a second, like modern philosophers have, two very important things about the human person, which would fall in line with the materialistic worldview we just talked about. Let's eliminate the idea that there is any idea of you outside of your body. And if we eliminate the idea that there's any formal cause for you, you don't really have an immortal soul. You're just matter. You're just your body. And the efficient cause is a biological process of your mom and dad getting together, right, and bringing you to existence. Then you have no final cause. You have no what? No meaning. So what I do with my body and who I do with my body and who I do it with my body doesn't really what? It doesn't matter. And if I treat somebody like a thing instead of like someone, that doesn't what? That doesn't matter either. Now think of it one step further, okay? If my human nature doesn't tell you that I'm masculine, and I'm going to just pick on somebody in the front row, if your human nature doesn't tell you that you're what? Feminine, and I have this idea about who I am and I'm trapped in this material body, but my concept of who I am contradicts the body that I have, then if I'm a guy and I think I'm a girl, I can become a what? A girl. And if I'm a girl and I think I'm a what? Then there's no consequence for me becoming a guy. Let's read that quote from Edward Fazer again. The metaphysical reality of who we are would say in our very nature, that's contrary to what's good for us as human beings. But if you eliminate that, what measuring stick is there for that? There isn't one.
So everything is permissible.
Everything. Immorality. Everything
is permissible.
It becomes, as you see in evolution, survival of the what? The fittest, not the nicest.
But how do we explain that some things just are wrong, independent of human opinion? Some people may say, well, there are no independent human opinions. They'll say that there is no right or wrong. Everything's relative. Well, relativism is false. For example, the American atheist Sam Harris says that tolerance, when it's used as a rationale to defend relativism, that it's ultimately contradictory. Think about this. If you're a relativist and you say there are no absolute right or wrongs, we have to tolerate everyone's moral opinions, what about someone whose opinions are intolerant? They think it's right to kill people who disagree with them. What does the relativist do? If he says, oh, that's fine, I tolerate that, then it's okay to be intolerant. It's okay to not be a relativist. If the relativist says, oh, that's wrong, you can't be intolerant, well, then the relativist is saying that some things are really wrong. So either way, he's caught in a contradiction. If relativism is true, it's false. And if it's false, it's still false. Because some things are just right or wrong. Anyone who says there is no right or wrong, if they say there are no absolutes, guess what? That's an absolute statement. There are no absolutes. If you try to absolutely defend relativism, it's like a dog chasing his own tail. It's just not going to happen. You're just going to get tired and want to take a nap. So I think we can show relativism is false. And people who even disagree with the church, there are some things they think just really are wrong. That genocide really is wrong. It's always wrong to rape women. It's always wrong to torture children because you like hearing their screams. But what explains why it's wrong? I think there's really only 4 possible options. First, evolution, something that's below us ontologically. People might say, well, we evolved morality. We learned from evolution that if you go around stealing, raping, and killing each other people are going to kill you. So we evolved a moral sense to be nice. The problem with this argument is that there are many bad, evil things we could do that would be fine from an evolutionary perspective. Remember, evolution isn't survival of the most moral. It's survival of the fittest. So, for example, from an evolutionary perspective, it wouldn't be wrong to take babies who have a genetic defect, even a mild one like Down syndrome, and just drown them in a river. If every parent did that, well, it's not going to destabilize society because we're not babies, nothing bad will happen to us, and it'll make our gene pool fitter. But I hope most people think, I think it's wrong to drown babies in rivers. So evolution can't explain these moral values. That evolution teaches us how to survive. Objective morality says it would be better to die than to commit a gross act of evil against another person. What explains that? We might say, well, morality comes from the individual, comes from ourselves, that we ultimately decide right and wrong. But the problem is if morality comes from an individual, then you can't tell individuals apart who's moral and immoral. The father who loves and cares and feeds for his daughter is just as moral as the father who molests his daughter. Because remember, if morality comes from the individual, you can't say these two men, one is wrong and the other is right. You could just say you dislike what one does and you like what the other does. It'd be like saying, I like what he wears, but I don't like what he wears. But that's not how morality works. We don't say, I'm not a big fan of torturing babies. It's not my thing. I more like watching football. No, we say torturing babies is wrong. You should not do that. It is wrong. It's a fact. What makes it a fact, though? People might say, well, Trent, it's not just individuals, it's society. Society determines right and wrong. Society says molesting children is wrong. We agree it harms people, and society determines right and wrong. But here's the problem. Now how do you decide between societies? How do you tell which one is moral or not? If I showed you a map of the world and showed you which countries said that marital rape or the violent rape of a spouse are legal or illegal, it would look like a checkerboard. In some countries like ours, marital rape is illegal. But in other countries, it's not a crime to rape your spouse. It wasn't a crime here before 1970. But just because different cultures believe different things about morality, how does that show there's no moral wrong? There are cultures who believe false things about history. They think the Holocaust never happened. Doesn't mean they're right. If morality is dependent on culture, you can't say one society is better than another. You can only say they're different. Even worse, if morality comes from society, all social reformers are wrong. The person who tries to change society to end segregation, like Martin Luther King Jr., he's just as wrong as the person from NAMBLA who tries to change the laws to make pedophilia legal. They're both in the minority, and society says they're wrong. But one is really right. And I think the only way to explain that would be if there was a moral law that transcended time, place, and culture. That there are really right and really wrong things independent of what people believe, even large groups of people. And that would make sense if there was a perfect moral person that arranged the world according to a moral law, a person we would call God.
Real quick, morality doesn't come within the individual. Evolution of society comes from something outside of it. This is a great way to introduce the idea that we have an objective moral law that's been given to us. And the only difference between us and other Christians is the final authority of the moral compass in my life as a Catholic doesn't reside within me. It resides in something what? Outside of me. At least that's what I claim when I say I'm in union with the Catholic what? Church. Final authority, the moral compass of my life is God, not my personal what? Opinion. That's a tough pill to swallow for a lot of people, but it's true.
Some people say, well, God is just something that people made up. They made up God to explain the world around them because they couldn't figure it out. God causes the lightning. God is here so we don't have to feel lonely. But just because some people were mistaken in their reasoning about God and the universe, how does that show God doesn't exist? That isn't actually an argument being put forward. All it is an alternative explanation People came up with God so they wouldn't be lonely. Well, I could say people came up with atheism so they wouldn't feel guilty. Why not? They're both valid explanations. Instead of psychoanalyzing each other and trying to figure out our motives, let's just look at the evidence and see if the evidence points towards there being a God or not. Even if people made up the idea of God, he could still exist. We have to look at the evidence that's involved. Some atheists will say, well, you know what, Trent, you're actually an atheist. Pardon? Yeah, you don't believe in lots of gods that were made up by people. You don't believe in Zeus, you don't believe in Thor. I, the atheist, just believe in one less God than you do. But that's a strange argument. I am no more an atheist because there are some gods I don't believe in than I am an anarchist because there are some forms of government I don't believe in. Atheism isn't just saying that some gods don't exist. Atheism is the view there are no gods anywhere. God does not exist. An anarchist couldn't say, oh, well, you're an anarchist just like me because you don't believe in kings or councils of elders, so we should be anarchists. Well, no, just because some forms of government are bad or inefficient doesn't mean there are no good forms of government. Likewise, just because some versions or concepts of God are contradictory or mythological, that doesn't show there isn't a real concept of God. After all, the existence of counterfeit money doesn't prove there's no real money. So the existence of counterfeit gods doesn't show there's no real God. We have to go back to the evidence. Now, some people will say, well, I got one for you. The God you believe in, this is reason 4, is contradictory. He's just as contradictory as the other gods you say don't exist. I say, well, why do you think that? And usually people will bring up different properties of God and say they're contradictory. Here's a classic one. If God is all-powerful, or he's omnipotent, can he make a rock so big that not even he can lift it? If he can make the rock, well, there's something he can't do. He can't lift it. And if he can't make the rock, that's also something he can't do. So he's not omnipotent. And if he's not omnipotent, he's not God. God doesn't exist. The problem with these arguments from contradiction is they misunderstand God. It's true, if God were a contradiction, like a square circle, he couldn't exist. But these contradictions that an atheist might put forward, they just misunderstand God as an infinitely perfect person. Omnipotence doesn't mean you can just do any old thing, or you can do any string of words. It just means you can do anything that's logically possible. So God can't do logical contradictions. In fact, if he could, that would make him imperfect. So he can't make square circles. He can't make married bachelors. He can't make something he can't control, because a perfect being can control everything. God can't lie or sin, for example. So God can't just do anything. He can do anything that's logically possible. And we find that with God's other attributes, the same arguments from contradiction fall apart if we properly understand the nature of God.
I actually had a kid at Catholic High in my first year teaching theology there ask me that question about, can God create a rock so big that even he can't lift it? And I loved the kids I taught over there, and I was able to answer the question because I had done my homework. The problem of evil. In fact, Thomas Aquinas in the Summa says this is the one argument that is a plausible argument that would be an argument against the existence of God. But our whole faith is a testimony against us, because the most evil thing that could have ever happened is that God could have become a human person, be totally rejected by man in his infinite love for us, and be crucified to save everyone. So the entire Christian faith is an answer to the problem of evil. Also, from my own personal experiences, philosophically, this is not difficult to refute. You're not omniscient, and neither am I, which means that we're not all-knowing. If you ever seen the movie Frequency, starring Jim Caviezel, the guy that played Jesus in The Passion of Christ, and Dennis Quaid. Dennis Quaid's his dad, he's a firefighter, and Jim Caviezel grows up, and when he's a kid, he dies in a fire. And through some suspension in time and space, he's able to use a shortwave radio when lightning hits and communicate with his dad back in time, right? And he tells his dad through the radio about the day his dad's supposed to die in the fire to save his dad's life, right? So his dad doesn't die in the fire. When his dad doesn't die in the fire, when his dad does die in the fire, in the original timeline, when his dad had passed away, his mom was a nurse at the hospital. And the minute she was supposed to give assistance and care to the specific patient, She was pulled away to be told her husband had passed away in a fire. So the patient didn't receive care, and that patient passed away. In the new timeline that had been created, when his father was kept alive, she was able to administer care to that patient. That patient was a serial killer who went on to kill 7 other people, including her. So unbeknownst to the son and the father gave his life to save his what? His wife's life. And unless he was omniscient, he would have never been able to know that. When something, I hear it all the time, bad things happen to good people. Yes, they do. And God allows suffering in your life for a reason. You want to know why? I'll give you 3. And I'm speaking from personal experience here. First of all, it's to remind you he's God and you're not. You're not in control. He is. Second of all, when suffering enters your life, real suffering enters your life, you start to examine yourself a little bit deeper than you ever have before. You start to ask those questions. You start to see your inadequacies. You start to own them. You start to realize that he's God and you're not. And that's the first step toward being purified. That's the first step toward holiness. A step away from something that's sinful towards something that's good. And the third thing, he brings about a greater good. He always does. Take any tragic thing that's happened. You notice people forget whether they're Republicans or Democrats when that happens? You notice people forget about the fact that they may not like somebody because they're different when that happens? You know what it brings out in each individual? A desire to will the good of the person next to you for their good, even to your own detriment. That's real love. My son has taught me that lesson. And I would have never learned it without him. When I give my testimony about Eli, I say that the day that I found out and I went back to St. Thomas More and I got up and thanked the people for praying for me and my family, and what I had perceived to be the worst week of my life, the beauty of this story is that I can stand here today and tell you, no, it was the best week of my life. I would never be where I am. I would not be the director of the Office of Catechesis had I not had my son. Because it drove me to find meaning and purpose and realize that this subjective personal experience I had with my son didn't validate my Catholicism. But the objective truth of the Catholic faith actually validated my experience. And it wasn't something that came from within me. It's something that had been outside of me. It was outside of me before I got here, and it's going to be outside of me once I'm what? Once I'm gone. It's objectively true. I don't tell people to believe Catholicism. I don't believe it because I think it's true. I've come to believe it because I know it's true. Top to bottom. I'm not omniscient. I'm not God. And theologically, it's a little more difficult when you're going through it, but we have a great teaching. Redemptive suffering. And we don't talk about it enough. Embrace your cross. Don't run away from it. And God will transform your life. He'll take whatever the world says is a tragedy and turn it into a triumph. And when you unite your sufferings to his, as St. Paul says in his letter to the Colossians, now I rejoice in my suffering for your sake. For in my flesh I complete what is lacking, the afflictions of Christ for the sake of his body, the church. Does that mean what Jesus did on Calvary wasn't sufficient for our sanctification or our redemption? Absolutely not. It means that Jesus Christ wants you to experience in your humanity every single thing he did in his, including the cross. And he went to the depths of it. So when you're in the middle of that cross, he's going to be looking you right there with you, face to face. And you'll become other Christs in the world. What do we call those guys? Saints. Because your suffering has redemptive value for you and for somebody else. And that is a greater good. Okay, I'm going to close with a quote. I got this from a friend who's here today. Dr. Robert Jastrow is a contemporary of Edwin Hubble. He wrote a book, God and Astronomers. It says, for the scientist who has lived his life by faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. The God of rational philosophy, who is in his essence existence itself, and brings things into existence and holds them in existence solely for their benefit, with no return benefit to himself, is no different than the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who took on human nature and entered into time and space in the incarnation and offered himself as the ultimate sacrifice of love that continually wills the good of other as other over oneself for all eternity. Those two things are one in the what? The same. And there's no contradiction between faith and what? Reason. They complement. We have to give this stuff to our kids. And I want to thank you for taking your Saturday morning out here to come, and I hope that you got something out of this and you can use it with the people that you are working with. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. This comes from the Gospel of St. John, chapter 20, I think, verse 24 through 28. Thomas, called Didymus, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples said to him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, and put my finger into the nail marks, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." The rationalist, I need to see it to believe it. Now a week later, his disciples were again inside, and Thomas was with them. Jesus came, although the doors were locked, and stood in their midst and said, "Peace be with you." He said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Bring your hand and put it into my side. Do not be unbelieving, but believe." Notice Thomas didn't touch him. He just responded saying, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you come to believe because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and have believed." Just one thing to walk away with. Thomas couldn't see Jesus away from the church, the 12, the foundation of the Catholic Church. But when he came back with them, he could see Jesus clear as day. Are you a doubting Thomas? Must you see in order to truly believe? Are those who have authentic, supernatural faith, based on the far side of reason, really irrational? Perhaps it's just the opposite. Maybe it is those who relentlessly persist in an unhealthy rationalism that are really irrational. There isn't 100% proof of anything, and if God gave us that kind of evidence for his existence, then he'd be coercing us into loving and choosing him, instead of giving us a chance to choose that. For whoever is without love does not know God, for God is love. A God of authentic love will leave just enough evidence for those who are truly seeking him, and enough wiggle room for those who are seeking a reason to reject him. In charity, I sincerely ask, which one are you and why? Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Catechetical Corner, handing on and defending the faith. And join us next time as Father Patrick Broussard conducts a workshop on the sacrament of the Most Holy Eucharist to respond to a recent Pew Research poll showing 70% of baptized Catholics either do not believe in the true presence of Jesus Christ, body, blood, soul, and divinity in the Eucharist, or profess in error to believe that the Church teaches it's merely a symbol. God love you, and we'll see you next time.
When you